He always knew his fate was set in stone: wealth, tradition, and a marriage of convenience. But then she showed up, an independent woman, passionate about art and knowledge. Caught between duty and desire, he'll have to decide what legacy he wants to leave behind. Before we begin, please like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this one. The sun reflected off the golden domes of St. Francis Church as Thomas Bennet surveyed his hometown from the balcony of his family's stately manor. Oakridge, with its cobblestone streets and colonial mansions, was more than just a historic landmark in Virginia. It was the cradle of his family's fortune, cultivated through generations since Imperial America. As the sole heir to the region's largest estate, Thomas carried the weight of tradition on his shoulders. At 32, with a law degree from Harvard University, he competently managed the properties and investments left by his father. But there was still one expectation he had yet to fulfill: joining with a family of equal prestige to strengthen the bonds of power that supported the family empire. "Thomas, your Uncle Edward just arrived," housekeeper Martha announced, interrupting his thoughts. "He says he needs to speak with you urgently about the preparations for the Winter Festival." The Oakridge Winter Festival was the most important event on the town's social calendar. This year, the Bennet estate would host the opening ceremony, and Edward, as president of the Cultural Foundation, never missed an opportunity to remind his nephew of the responsibility this represented. "My dear nephew," Edward exclaimed as he saw Thomas descend the noble wooden staircase, "we need to finalize the details. This festival will be crucial for your future." Thomas knew exactly what that meant. His uncle had invited all the traditional families of Virginia, including the Harringtons, whose only daughter, Catherine, was considered by the family to be the obvious choice for an advantageous marriage. "Uncle, we've already discussed this, and we'll continue discussing it until you understand what's at stake," Edward insisted as they walked through the main hall, where portraits of ancestors seemed to watch them with approval. "The Harringtons have political connections we need. Catherine is a well-educated young woman from an impeccable family, and completely obsessed with status," Thomas completed quietly. "That's exactly what you need to maintain this house and everything we've built," Edward retorted, gesturing to the luxury around them. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ryan, a childhood friend, and now the town's cultural secretary. "Pardon the intrusion," Ryan began, "but I thought you'd like to know, Thomas. Professor Eleanor Sullivan has accepted our invitation to give the opening lecture at the festival." Edward frowned. "Paul Sullivan's widow. I thought she rarely accepted public invitations." "Exactly why it's a triumph," Ryan responded enthusiastically. "She's one of the foremost experts on American colonial art. Having someone of her caliber opening our festival is a prestige that not even Charleston achieved this year." The name sparked Thomas's curiosity. Eleanor Sullivan was almost a mythical figure in the region, widowed at 30, inheritor of her husband's lands and collection, a renowned historian. After his passing, she transformed the historic farm into a cultural and research center that attracted academics from across the country. She lived discreetly, rarely appearing at social events, which only enhanced her aura of mystery. "And will she come alone?" asked Edward, in a tone that didn't hide his disapproval of the woman who lived independently of traditional circles. "She'll bring some assistance and exhibition materials," Ryan replied. "Thomas, I thought you might receive her personally. After all, it was your father who first acquired pieces from the Sullivan collection." Thomas's uncle made to protest, but his nephew was quicker. "It would be my pleasure. Schedule a preliminary meeting. I'd like to see the material she intends to present." 2 weeks later, Thomas drove his car along the winding road that led to Willow Creek Farm, Eleanor's property. The further he got from Oakridge, the more the scenery changed, from colonial buildings to the intense green of the Virginian mountains. The farm appeared after a curve, a large house in colonial style, restored with historical precision, surrounded by well-kept gardens and small buildings that served as studios and research rooms. He was received on the porch by a woman who defied the descriptions he had heard in the salons of Virginian society. Eleanor Sullivan did not wear the mourning clothes that many still expected of her. nor did she have the bitter countenance that malicious gossip attributed to her. She dressed with simple elegance, dark pants and a white linen shirt, her brown hair tied in a low bun that revealed delicate yet firm features. "Mr. Bennett, welcome to Willow Creek," she greeted him with polite formality, extending her hand in a firm gesture. "Ryan spoke very highly of your interest in our work." There was something in her voice, a mixture of authority and gentleness, that immediately captured Thomas's attention. Over the next 2 hours, she guided him around the property, showing the historical preservation work she had undertaken. She spoke passionately about each piece, each document, each restoration technique. She wasn't just an heir managing a legacy. She was a dedicated scholar with knowledge that would impress any academic. "I intend to present these pieces at the festival," she explained, showing a collection of votive offerings and folk sacred art. They're expressions of faith that rarely receive proper attention in official circuits. They represent the true soul of Virginian people. "It's fascinating material," Thomas commented sincerely. "My father would have loved to see this. He always said that true history isn't in official books, but in the marks left by ordinary people." Something in Eleanor's gaze subtly changed. "Your father was a rare man. One of the few who valued this kind of knowledge," she remarked, before offering coffee served in antique china. On the porch of the main house, with a view of the mountains turning orange with the sunset, conversation flowed with surprising naturalness. Eleanor spoke about her projects, her research, her desire to democratize access to culture. Thomas found himself sharing thoughts he rarely expressed, his doubts about the path laid out by his family, his desire to do something more meaningful with the privilege he had inherited. "It's getting dark," she observed after they had talked. "For hours. The return journey can be treacherous at night." Thomas didn't want to leave. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly heard, understood, but he nodded, rising. "Thank you for the afternoon, Professor. It was enlightening." "Eleanor," she corrected with a slight smile. "We can leave titles for lectures." On the way back to Oak Ridge, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about her. It wasn't just her understated beauty or her intelligence that had impressed him. It was something deeper, an authenticity, an inner strength that contrasted with the superficiality he encountered in the circles he frequented. What he didn't know was that on the way to town he had crossed paths with Catherine, Harrington's car, who had observed his departure from the farm with calculating eyes. Nor did he imagine that this seemingly casual meeting would forever change the course of his life and the fate of all Oak Ridge. The Bennett estate gleamed on the opening night of the winter festival. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the main hall, where the elite of Virginia circulated among glasses of sparkling wine and canapes served by impeccably dressed waiters. Edward Bennett, in his Italian-cut suit, played the role of perfect host, introducing influential people to his nephew like someone displaying pieces on a chessboard. "Thomas, come meet the new State Secretary of Culture," he called, beckoning to his nephew, who was watching the entrance to the hall. But Thomas's gaze was fixed on the figure who had just arrived. Eleanor Sullivan wore a dark blue dress of simple but elegant cut, which contrasted with the excessively ornate outfits of the other women present. Her hair was loose, framing a face that needed no artifice to draw attention. She carried a discreet leather portfolio, probably notes for her lecture, and was accompanied by 2 young assistants who seemed intimidated by the environment. "Go receive her," murmured Ryan, appearing beside his friend. "Your uncle is too busy flattering the secretary to notice." Thomas crossed the hall, aware of the gazes that followed him. The Bennett heir rarely showed such interest in a guest. "Eleanor, welcome," he said, extending his hand. "I hope the journey was smooth." "Thank you for the invitation, Thomas," she replied with a discreet smile. "I confess these social events aren't my natural environment, but the opportunity to share our work is worth the discomfort. I promise I'll try to make the experience less painful," he joked, offering her his arm. "Let me show you where your presentation will be tomorrow." As they walked through the hall, Thomas introduced her to some key people, keeping her comfortably away from the more conservative groups. It didn't escape his notice how Eleanor easily charmed those she spoke with not through social affectation, but through the genuine passion with which she spoke about art and history. Even the most skeptical academic seemed impressed with her knowledge. From one corner of the hall, Catherine Harrington observed the scene with growing displeasure. Daughter of federal Judge Anthony Harrington, she had been raised with the certainty that her destiny was to become the mistress of the Bennett estate. Years of socializing at events had fed her expectation, despite Thomas's polite indifference. "Who is that woman?" she asked one of her friends, without taking her eyes off the couple. "The Sullivan widow, the main speaker. They say she's been living practically isolated on that farm since her husband passed away." "She doesn't seem so isolated to me," Catherine commented acidly, observing how Thomas leaned in to hear something Eleanor was saying. "Interesting, how a woman who barely appears in society manages to secure a prominent place at the most important event of the year." "She's a respected specialist," her friend replied, uncomfortable with the tone. "Specialist in what exactly?" Catherine picked up a champagne flute from a tray. "Because she seems to be doing an excellent job of enchanting our host." On the other side of the hall, oblivious to the comments, Thomas was showing Eleanor a rarely exhibited painting, a small work from the colonial period depicting everyday life in Oakridge. "This was one of the first my father acquired," he explained. "He used to say that the true history of America is in the common scenes, not in the pompous portraits of the powerful." Eleanor approached the painting, her eyes shining with genuine interest. "It's an extraordinary piece. See how the artist captured the light on the stone streets, the shadows on the facades. There's so much life here." "Exactly what my father would say," Thomas replied, surprised by the synchronicity. "You would have liked him." "We did meet, actually," she revealed, to Thomas's astonishment. "Before I got married, he was one of the first to support the cataloging work that Paul initiated." The revelation created a new dimension to their connection. As they talked about the past, about art and memory, Thomas found himself increasingly fascinated by this woman who seemed to exist in a parallel universe to the superficial world of social conventions that surrounded him. "Thomas!" Catherine's strident voice interrupted the moment. "Your uncle is looking for you. The secretary wants to meet you." "Thank you, Catherine. I'm coming." He turned to Eleanor. "Forgive me. I must attend to my uncle. I promise I'll return to continue our conversation." "Don't worry," Eleanor replied, serene. "I have some details of the presentation to review with my assistants." As Thomas reluctantly moved away, Catherine remained, her cordial smile not reaching her eyes. "Mrs. Sullivan, what a pleasure to finally meet you. I'm Catherine Harrington." "The pleasure is mine," Eleanor responded, immediately sensing the veiled hostility. "It must be very lonely living away from town," Catherine commented with false concern, "especially after becoming a widow so young." "I have my work, my students, nature. I rarely feel alone," Eleanor calmly responded. "Of course, your work." Catherine let the words hang in the air. "I heard you're interested in quite alternative practices, medicinal herbs, folk rituals, that sort of thing." Eleanor maintained, her composure though she felt the venom in the words. "I study American cultural manifestations in all their forms. Popular healing traditions are an important part of our history." "Fascinating," Catherine smiled calculatingly. "You know, Thomas has always been very traditional. His family values social conventions greatly, which is understandable considering their position. It would be a shame if he became involved with ideas that could compromise the family legacy." The threat was clear, but before Eleanor could respond, they were interrupted by Ryan's arrival. "Mrs. Sullivan, forgive me, but we need to review the equipment for tomorrow," he said, casting a disapproving look at Catherine. "Excuse me, Miss Harrington," Eleanor said politely. "It was a pleasure to meet you." As Ryan led her away, Eleanor realized she had entered a minefield. Thomas's interest in her had clearly awakened hostilities that could complicate her participation in the festival. "Don't pay attention to Catherine," Ryan murmured. "She's always considered herself Thomas's future wife, despite him never showing interest." "I understand," Eleanor replied. "Perhaps I should keep my distance. I didn't come to create problems." On the contrary, Ryan smiled. I've never seen Thomas so excited about this festival. It would be a shame to disappoint him. On the other side of the hall, with his uncle and the Secretary of Culture, Thomas participated in the conversation only physically. His thoughts and gaze remained focused on Eleanor. There was something about her that intrigued him deeply, not just her understated beauty or intelligence, but an authenticity that contrasted with the artificial environment in which he lived. Edward, noticing his nephew's distraction, followed his gaze to Eleanor. His countenance hardened slightly, but he maintained the perfect social smile. Secretary, have you met our festival's main speaker, Professor Sullivan? Thomas, why don't you bring her to join us? The request sounded like a polite order. Thomas nodded, seeing the opportunity to rescue Eleanor from what appeared to be an uncomfortable conversation with Catherine. When he reached her, Ryan had already removed her from the situation. My uncle would like to introduce you to the Secretary of Culture, he explained, noticing how she seemed subtly tense. Is everything all right? Perfectly, Eleanor replied, composing herself. Just adapting to the environment. The evening continued with formal introductions and superficial conversations. To observers, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just an attentive host receiving an important guest. But to those who watched, more carefully like Catherine and Edward, something more was happening. When the event began to disperse late at night, Thomas found Eleanor in the library, admiring the collection of rare books. I hope you survived the evening, he joked, partially closing the door to muffle the noise from the hall. It was more interesting than I expected, she replied with a slight smile. Your family has built an impressive collection. Generations of Bennets accumulating everything that shines, he commented, with a touch of irony that surprised them both. Forgive me, I shouldn't speak like that. On the contrary, Eleanor replied, coming closer. It's refreshing to hear honesty in this environment. For a moment they were silent, the tension between them as palpable as electricity in the air. Thomas had never felt for anyone what he was experiencing now, a desire not just physical, but for deep connection, for mutual understanding. Eleanor, The library door opened completely, revealing Edward. Ah, here you are, Thomas, the last guests are leaving. I'll arrange transportation to your hotel, Professor, Thomas said, returning to a formal tone. Nonsense, Edward intervened with a calculated smile. The professor will stay here at the estate like all the main speakers. I've already arranged for your belongings to be taken to the guest room. Tomorrow will be an important day, and we want you to be perfectly rested. The invitation left. No room for refusal and seemed perfectly reasonable, just perfect Virginian hospitality. But both Thomas and Eleanor perceived the strategy. Edward wanted to maintain control over the situation. What none of them knew was that while they were talking in the library, Catherine had found the leather portfolio that Eleanor had momentarily left on a table in the hall, and with agile fingers guided by jealousy, she had quickly examined its contents, her malicious gaze brightening upon finding something she could use to her advantage. The first light of morning filtered through the lace curtains of the guest room when Eleanor awoke. For a moment she felt disoriented as she contemplated the ornate ceiling and antique furniture, so different from the functional simplicity of her farm. The previous evening returned in fragments, the illuminated hall, the curious glances, Catherine's veiled hostility, and especially the unexpected connection with Thomas. She got up and went to the window. The estate's garden was a small colonial paradise, with carefully pruned rose bushes and a stone path that wound between centuries-old trees. In the background, the towers of Oak Ridge's churches stood out against the still rosy sky. It was a view that inspired reverence, the same one that generations of Bennets had contemplated while making decisions that shaped the region's history. A light knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Good morning, Professor, housekeeper Martha entered with a tray. Mr. Thomas asked me to bring you breakfast. Your lecture is only at 10, but he thought you might like time to prepare. Very kind, thank you, Eleanor replied, noticing the curiosity in the eyes of the woman who was clearly trying to assess the nature of her relationship with her employer. Mr. Thomas left early to resolve some issues at the town hall where your presentation will be held, Martha explained, arranging the tray on a table. "He asked me to accompany you there when you're ready." As the housekeeper left, Eleanor checked her phone. There were 3 messages from her assistants confirming that everything was prepared for the presentation. But when she looked for her notes in the leather portfolio, she noticed with alarm that some pages were out of order. Someone had gone through her belongings during the night. At the Oak Ridge Town Hall, Thomas was supervising the final technical adjustments. The place had been transformed for the festival, the stage decorated with arrangements reminiscent of Virginian colonial art, the rows of chairs already almost completely occupied by academics, students, and curious individuals. "We're at maximum capacity," Ryan commented, approaching with a smile. "Professor Sullivan's lecture is the most anticipated event of the festival." "Deservedly so," Thomas replied, satisfied. "But where is my uncle? He never misses an opportunity to appear at events like this." "First meeting with Anthony Harrington and the Quaesor. Bishop," Ryan explained, lowering his voice. "It seems some questions have arisen about the content of Eleanor's presentation." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean? The material was approved weeks ago." "I don't know details, but Catherine was with them." The mention of Catherine immediately aroused concern in Thomas. He knew well the manipulative nature of the judge's daughter, her ability to distort situations to her advantage. "I'll check what's happening," he said, heading to the meeting room at the back of the town hall. As he approached, he heard his uncle's voice in an exalted tone. "This is a respectable institution. We cannot allow our name to be associated with questionable practices." Thomas entered without knocking. Edward, Anthony Harrington, Bishop Richard, and Catherine turned to him, surprised by the interruption. "What's happening here?" he asked. "Directly." Catherine was the first to speak, her face composed in an expression of calculated concern. "Thomas, we wanted to spare you this embarrassment, but troubling information has emerged about your guest." She slid some of the pages she had stolen from Eleanor's portfolio across the table. Notes on folk rituals, recipes for medicinal herbs used by traditional communities in Virginia, and photographs of votive offerings that would be presented in the lecture. "These are just notes for her presentation on American folk culture," Thomas argued, immediately recognizing the material. "What's the problem?" "The problem, my nephew," Edward intervened, "is that these are not practices our community endorses. This woman studies pagan rituals, potions, and enchantments. We cannot have this type of content at our festival." "They're American cultural manifestations, Uncle," Thomas retorted, incredulous. "Part of our history that rarely receives academic attention." "Thomas," Bishop Richard spoke in a measured voice, "I understand your enthusiasm for cultural diversity, but as community leaders, we need to be cautious about the messages we endorse. Some of these practices are clearly contrary to the Christian values that underpin our society." Anthony Harrington, with his authority as a federal judge, added gravity to the discussion. "There's also the question of the Bennett family's reputation. An association with this type of research could be misinterpreted." Thomas looked at each of them, perceiving the trap that was closing. It wasn't about the lecture. It was about Eleanor, about the interest he had shown in her, about the threat she posed to the carefully laid plan for his future. "This is ridiculous," he finally said. "Eleanor Sullivan is an internationally respected researcher. Canceling her lecture would be an academic scandal." "No one mentioned canceling," Catherine intervened smoothly. "Just adapting the content, removing the more controversial elements." "The lecture starts in less than an hour," Thomas protested. "You can't demand that she alter all her work." "Actually, we can," Edward asserted, "as main sponsors and hosts of the event." At this moment, the door opened again, and Eleanor entered, accompanied by Martha. Her gaze quickly took in the scene, the pages of her notes spread across the table, the accusing expressions. "I see someone took an interest in my work," she commented, with surprising calmness. "Though I would have appreciated, if they had asked, permission before examining my personal documents." "Professor Sullivan," the bishop stepped forward, "we were just discussing some aspects of your presentation that seem problematic to us." "Problems of what nature, exactly?" she asked, maintaining her dignity. These herb recipes, these rituals, Catherine intervened, indicating the pages, they're practices associated with witchcraft in many communities. Eleanor smiled slightly, like someone explaining something simple to a child. Miss Harrington, what you call witchcraft is traditional American knowledge. These are medicinal recipes documented since the colonial period, many of them incorporated into modern pharmacopoeia. The rituals are syncretic cultural manifestations, a fundamental part of the formation of national identity that families like yours take such pride in. The polite but firm response left Catherine momentarily speechless. Taking advantage of the silence, Eleanor continued, addressing the bishop. Bishop Richard, I have immense respect for your spiritual authority, but as an academic, my duty is to document and preserve American cultural richness in all its dimensions, including those that have been historically marginalized or persecuted. The bishop looked uncomfortable, like someone who didn't expect to face such an articulate opponent. No one questions the academic value, Professor, Edward intervened. We're just concerned about how this information will be received by our community. A community that should be proud of its history, not fear it, Eleanor replied, looking directly at him. The votive offerings I intend to show are exhibited in museums worldwide. The herbs I document are still used today in folk medicine. None of this is controversial in the academic environment. Thomas watched admiringly how Eleanor defended herself, with elegance and firmness, without retreating an inch but also without unnecessarily antagonizing. A very different approach from the defensive posture most would adopt. I think we're exaggerating the situation, he finally said. Professor Sullivan didn't come here to promote any practices, just to document them as part of our history. It would be an immeasurable loss for the festival if we limited her work. Anthony Harrington, who until then had been observing with a severe expression, intervened. Perhaps there's a middle ground. The lecture can proceed, provided the professor clarifies that she's presenting these practices only as objects of historical study without endorsing their contemporary use. Eleanor nodded, perceiving the diplomatic exit. Certainly. My intention was never otherwise. The bishop seemed relieved by the solution, but Catherine didn't hide her disappointment. The plan to publicly discredit Eleanor was crumbling. It's settled then, Edward concluded, though his tone indicated he was far from satisfied. The lecture will proceed as scheduled, with the caveat suggested by Dr. Harrington. As everyone prepared to leave the room, Catherine approached Eleanor, speaking quietly enough that only she could hear. This isn't over, Professor. People like you don't belong in our circle, and Thomas will soon realize that. Eleanor maintained a neutral expression, refusing to show any reaction to the veiled threat. I hope you enjoy my lecture, Miss Harrington. Perhaps you'll learn something new about your own roots. The silent exchange of hostilities didn't go unnoticed by Thomas, who observed the two with growing concern. He knew Catherine well enough to know she wouldn't give up easily. This small confrontation was just the beginning. When the group left the room to head to the auditorium, Thomas managed a moment alone with Eleanor. I apologize for this, he said, genuinely embarrassed. I don't know how your notes ended up in their hands. I do, Eleanor calmly replied. Someone went through my portfolio last night. Initially, I thought it might have been you, interested in learning more about my work. I would never do that, Thomas assured, horrified by the idea. I realize that now, she smiled slightly. You defended me when it would have been much more convenient to join them. I defended what's just, he replied, though they both knew there was more to his gesture than mere principles. A silence laden with meaning hung between them, unspoken words, feelings that were growing rapidly despite all the circumstances that conspired against them. Your lecture will be brilliant, Thomas finally said, and I'll be in the front row. Eleanor nodded, grateful for the support. Then I won't disappoint you. As they walked to the auditorium, neither of them noticed they were being observed from a distance by Catherine, whose eyes reflected an implacable determination. The first attempt to drive Eleanor away had failed, but she was already devising a much more dangerous plan. One that would involve not just accusations of controversial practices, but a carefully woven plot to completely destroy the reputation of the woman who had dared to awaken Thomas's interest. The town hall auditorium was completely packed when Eleanor took the stage. Under the lights, her figure conveyed a serenity that contrasted with the tension of the previous moments. Thomas watched from the front row, next to Ryan, while his uncle Edward, Anthony Harrington, the bishop, and Catherine occupied strategic places like judges ready to evaluate every word. "Good morning, everyone," Eleanor began, her clear voice projecting perfectly through the space. "It's an honor to be here to share some of the research I've been developing on American folk cultural manifestations that rarely receive proper academic attention." For 2 hours, she led the audience on a fascinating journey through the folk culture of Virginia, from healers who preserved ancestral knowledge to syncretic manifestations that combined African, Native American, and European elements. The projected images showed votive offerings, medicinal potions, folk festivals, and rituals that had been documented by the first European travelers in America. Eleanor kept to the agreement, making it clear that she was presenting these practices as objects of historical and anthropological study, without endorsing their contemporary use. But she did this with such skill that instead of sounding like an imposed disclaimer, it seemed a natural part of her scientific methodology. "Wakiti, cultural richness lies precisely in diversity," she concluded. "In the ability that the American people developed to absorb, transform, and give new meanings to diverse influences, creating unique expressions that need to be preserved as the intangible heritage of the nation." The applause was enthusiastic. University professors, students, and even more conservative figures from the community seemed genuinely impressed. Even the bishop was politely applauding, apparently satisfied with the balance Eleanor had found. Only Catherine remained impassive, her cold eyes calculating the next move. After the question and answer session, as the crowd dispersed to other festival events, Thomas approached the stage where Eleanor was storing her materials. "That was extraordinary," he said sincerely. "You transformed what could have been a disaster into a triumph." "Thank you for your support," she replied, a slight blush tinging her cheeks. "I couldn't have done it without your intervention." "Nonsense," Thomas smiled. "You would have found a way out even without me. I've never seen anyone handle my uncle and the bishop with such elegance." Before Eleanor could respond, they were interrupted by Edward, who approached with an expression difficult to decipher. "Professor Sullivan," he began formally, "I must admit that your presentation was enlightening. The balance you demonstrated in addressing potentially controversial topics was admirable. It was as close to a compliment as someone like Edward Bennett could offer in such circumstances." Eleanor accepted the comment with a gracious nod. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Bennett, and your family's hospitality. Speaking of which," Edward continued, "we would like to invite you to dinner at the estate tonight. Some academics and important figures from the region will be present. It would be an opportunity to delve deeper into some of the issues raised today." Thomas observed his uncle with barely disguised surprise. He knew the strategy well enough. When one can't defeat an opponent, one tries to co-opt them, bringing them into the circle where they can be controlled. "It would be an honor," Eleanor replied, equally aware of the game, but willing to play it. "Excellent," Edward smiled, artificially cordial. "Thomas, why don't you take the professor to see other historical points in town during the afternoon? I'm sure she would appreciate a guided tour by someone who knows our history so well." The invitation, formulated as a suggestion, was actually a calculated maneuver. Edward knew that rumors about Thomas's interest in Eleanor were already circulating. By encouraging them to be seen together publicly, he created a narrative he could control, a gesture of hospitality from the Bennett family to a respected academic, nothing more. "It will be a pleasure," Thomas replied, entering the game, but for completely different reasons. The rest of the afternoon passed like a dream for both. Thomas guided Eleanor through the cobblestone streets of Oakridge, showing her colonial churches, museums, and viewpoints that offered spectacular views of the colonial town nestled among mountains. To the eyes of those watching, and there were many observers, They appeared to be just host and distinguished guest, but in the moments when they found themselves alone, the electricity between them was almost palpable. "Has this place always been your home?" Eleanor asked when they stopped at a viewpoint that offered a panoramic view of the town. "Physically, yes," Thomas replied, observing the horizon. "But I've always felt like a foreigner in the expectations that come with the Bennett name, as if I inhabited a house that was built for someone else." "I understand that feeling well," Eleanor commented, surprising him. You've always seemed so secure in your place in the world." Eleanor smiled slightly. "When Paul passed away, everyone expected me to sell the farm, to return to my family in New York, to retreat like a proper widow. Choosing to stay, to transform that space and follow my own path, was an act of rebellion that many still haven't forgiven me for. Including your in-laws," Thomas guessed. "Especially them," Eleanor confirmed. "They believed I was profaning their son's legacy by transforming the private collection into an open research center. And when I began studying folk cultural manifestations considered lesser by traditional academia, the rupture was complete." Thomas felt an even greater admiration for her. "It must have been difficult." "It was liberating," Eleanor corrected. "For the first time, I was following my own compass, not others' expectations." The words resonated deeply with Thomas, who had followed a script written by others all his life. The moment of intimacy was interrupted by the ringing of Eleanor's phone. It was one of her assistants, informing her that they were having problems with the transportation of some pieces for the next day's exhibition. "I need to resolve this," she said after hanging up. "My team is having logistical difficulties." "Let's go together," Thomas promptly offered. "I can help." The next 2 hours were dedicated to resolving practical issues, locating adequate transport for fragile pieces, negotiating with the exhibition, space administration, coordinating the assembly team. It was a side of Eleanor that Thomas hadn't yet seen: the efficient administrator, the leader respected by her team, the firm but fair negotiator. In each facet he discovered, he found more reasons to admire her. When they finally returned to the Bennett estate to prepare for dinner, the sun was already beginning to set, tinging the colonial facades with gold. In the immense entrance hall, they found Martha agitated. "Mr. Thomas, I'm so glad you're back. There was a problem with the dinner arrangements. The florist delivered completely different pieces than what was ordered, and the musicians just informed us they'll be arriving late." "I'm sure you'll resolve everything perfectly, Martha," he calmly replied. "You always do. But your uncle is insisting that he needs your approval for the substitutes, and Miss Catherine is already here, wanting to help with the decoration." Thomas sighed, foreseeing that he would be dragged into trivial decisions that were, in fact, just maneuvers by his uncle to keep him busy and away from Eleanor. "If I may," Eleanor gently intervened, "I can help with the flower arrangements. I have some experience with event decoration." Martha looked at her with surprise and relief. "That would be wonderful, Professor. The flowers are in the dining room." While Thomas was summoned to his uncle's office, Eleanor followed Martha to the immense hall where dinner would be served. The long tables were already covered with white linen tablecloths and fine porcelain, but the flower arrangements, orchids and roses that should compose the center of the tables, were clearly inadequate, with colors that clashed with the overall decoration. "Let's improvise something more harmonious," Eleanor suggested, beginning to dismantle and regroup the flowers with surprising skill. She was so concentrated on the work that she didn't immediately notice Catherine's arrival, who observed her from the door with a cold smile. "What an unusual scene," Catherine commented, entering the hall. "The illustrious Professor Sullivan arranging flowers like a servant." "I've always liked manual work," Eleanor replied without being disturbed, continuing her task. "I find it clears the mind." "It's certainly not something one would expect from an academic of your stature," Catherine insisted, approaching to examine the work. "But perhaps you're trying to impress our host with your multiple abilities." Eleanor finally raised her eyes to face her directly. "Miss Harrington, something tells me you didn't come here to discuss flower arrangements." Catherine smiled, abandoning the pretense. "You're perceptive." "Actually, I came to offer some friendly advice. I'm listening." "Thomas may seem interested in your originality at the moment, but you must understand that there are expectations for someone in his position. family commitments, social responsibilities. And you believe you represent those responsibilities, Eleanor concluded. Our families have a long history together, Catherine confirmed, without denying the inference. Some things are simply inevitable. His interest in you is just a phase, a passing curiosity. Eleanor continued working with the flowers, apparently unperturbed. If you're so sure of that, why bother with this conversation? The question hit its mark. For an instant, Catherine's mask of confidence faltered, revealing the underlying insecurity. Because you don't belong in this world, and the longer it takes for you to realize that, the more painful the fall will be, Catherine responded. Regaining her composure, it would be a shame if your academic reputation were compromised in the process. The threat was clear. Eleanor placed the last arrangement on the table before responding. You know what the difference is between us, Miss Harrington. I've built my life based on what I can create and contribute. You build yours based on who you can manipulate and control. It's a very fragile existence. The blow struck Catherine deeply, but before she could respond, they were interrupted by Martha's arrival, who was delighted with the transformation of the flower arrangements. Professor, it looks absolutely beautiful. Mr. Edward will be enchanted. I'm happy to help, Eleanor responded with a genuine smile for the housekeeper. Catherine, momentarily defeated, moved away with a final warning look at Eleanor. But as she left the hall, her phone was already in her hands, her quick fingers typing a message to a contact, simply identified as P. I need you to find something, anything, on her farm. The more compromising, the better. Pay whatever is necessary. The plan that had begun as a simple attempt to discredit the speaker was now transforming into something much darker. Catherine was willing to cross boundaries that no one would imagine she would transgress, all to eliminate the woman who threatened her carefully planned future. The dinner at the Bennet estate proceeded in an atmosphere of studied elegance. The social and intellectual elite of Oakridge circulated through the hall in their formal attire, crystal glasses reflecting the golden light of the chandeliers. After the initial tension, Eleanor's successful lecture had transformed her presence from controversy to attraction. Academics sought her company, curious to know more about her work, while figures from local society tried to include her in their conversations, attracted by the novelty she represented. Thomas observed the scene with discreet satisfaction. Eleanor navigated with natural grace among the various groups, without affectation or discomfort, as much at ease discussing archaeology with a university professor as she was conversing about local traditions with society ladies. His uncle Edward, always pragmatic, had clearly decided to capitalize on the guest speaker's success, proudly presenting her as a personal choice for the festival. She's really impressive, commented Ryan, approaching with 2 glasses of wine. She even won over the bishop, who's now discussing religious syncretism with her as if it were his favorite topic. Thomas accepted the glass offered by his friend. Eleanor has that effect on people. It's impossible not to respect her when you perceive the depth of her knowledge and the integrity of her work. And other attributes as well, it seems, Ryan teased with a knowing smile. I've never seen you so enchanted by someone. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's known you for more than 20 years, Ryan reassured him. But you'd better be careful. Catherine is watching your every move, and she doesn't seem at all pleased. Indeed, from across the hall, Catherine remained strategically positioned to monitor the interaction between Eleanor and the guests. Dressed in an elegant red dress that dramatically contrasted with her black hair, she was the personification of classic Virginian beauty, and she was perfectly aware of it. What few perceived beneath the impeccable social smile was the cold anger that grew with each compliment directed at her rival. The evening was advancing when Edward called for everyone's attention, raising his glass in a toast. I would like to thank each of you for your presence at this celebration of the culture and history of our dear Virginia. This festival has been an important milestone for our town, and I must acknowledge the fundamental role of Professor Eleanor Sullivan in its success. Polite applause echoed through the hall as gazes turned to Eleanor, who accepted the recognition with a modest nod. "Our family has always valued the preservation of true Virginian tradition," Edward continued, "and it's in this spirit that I have the pleasure of announcing that my nephew Thomas will, from next month, assume the presidency of the Bennett Cultural Foundation, continuing the legacy of our ancestors." New applause, more enthusiastic. Thomas received the announcement with barely disguised surprise. His uncle had not discussed this decision with him previously. It was a typical Edward maneuver, creating a fait accompli in public, impossible to refuse without causing embarrassment. "And to celebrate this new chapter," Edward continued, "we are planning a series of initiatives to value our cultural heritage. One of them, incidentally, will be a partnership with Professor Sullivan's Research Center for documentation of traditional cultural practices of Virginia." This last part of the announcement caused a visible commotion. Eleanor, who had not been consulted, could not completely hide her surprise. Thomas, equally caught off guard, sought her gaze from across the hall in a silent apology. What no one noticed, except Ryan, who was watching attentively, was the transformation in Catherine's countenance. A dangerous gleam appeared in her eyes, like someone who had just found the perfect weapon for her plan. Later, when the guests began to say goodbye, Thomas finally managed a moment alone with Eleanor on one of the estate's terraces. "I apologize for my uncle's announcement," he began. "I knew nothing about it." "I noticed," Eleanor smiled slightly. "It seems we're pawns in a game we don't yet fully understand. Your uncle is cunning," she continued. "By publicly linking us in a joint project, he neutralizes any rumors about the two of us, and at the same time, capitalizes on my academic credibility for the Foundation's benefit." Thomas admired her perception. "Exactly. But if you're not interested in this partnership, I can discreetly undo the arrangement." "On the contrary," Eleanor replied after a moment of reflection, "I think it could be a valuable opportunity, a chance to bring this work to a wider audience with the support of a respected institution." Their eyes met under the soft light coming from the hall windows, creating a moment of intimacy amid the social bustle. "Eleanor, here you are." Edward's voice interrupted the moment as he joined them on the terrace. "The mayor is leaving and insists on saying goodbye to both of you personally." The rest of the evening passed in a succession of formal goodbyes. When the last guest finally departed, Eleanor retired to her room, exhausted but satisfied with the day's events. Thomas and his uncle remained in the office, where Edward served himself a cognac before revealing his true intentions. "Professor, Sullivan is truly a remarkable woman," he commented casually. "I understand why you're fascinated." Thomas observed his uncle cautiously, sensing what would come next. "I won't deny that I deeply admire her." "As you should," Edward agreed, surprising him. "An alliance with her could be extremely advantageous for our family. Her work brings academic prestige, and the Bennett name can provide her with the institutional stability her project needs." The calculating coldness with which his uncle analyzed the situation deeply displeased Thomas. "I'm not interested in Eleanor for strategic advantages, Uncle." "Of course not," Edward smiled condescendingly, "but that doesn't prevent us from recognizing the advantages when they exist. Just remember that there are certain prior understandings that need to be respected." He didn't need to mention Catherine's name for his message to be clear. Eleanor could be an academic partner, perhaps even a discreet adventure, but the family commitment to the Harringtons remained untouched. "I think that's a decision that's up to me," Thomas responded with unusual firmness. "Naturally," Edward conceded, not seeming disturbed. "I just advise caution. Oak Ridge isn't New York or DC. Here, traditions still carry weight, and breaking certain expectations can have consequences that go beyond mere personal disappointments." With these enigmatic words, he withdrew, leaving Thomas alone with his conflicting thoughts. The next morning, while the Bennett estate still slept, Catherine was meeting in a discreet cafe in the historic center with a man of common appearance who could pass unnoticed in any crowd, exactly the type of person ideal for what she was planning. "Did you find anything?" she asked without preamble. "It was easier than we expected," the man, who went by the name of Peter, or P to his clients, responded, discreetly sliding an envelope across the table. One of her assistants at the farm needed money and was cooperative. Catherine carefully opened the envelope, examining its contents: photographs, pages from a handwritten notebook, and copies of old documents. What exactly am I looking at here? The widow has a private collection she doesn't show to anyone, Peter explained in a low voice. Texts on prosperity rituals, manipulation of herbs considered magical, notes on practices that some would call witchcraft. This is just academic research, Catherine commented, disappointed. She already explained this in the lecture. Turn the page, Peter insisted, with a malicious smile. The next photograph showed something different, a small altar in a reserved corner of Eleanor's personal library, with elements that could easily be interpreted as esoteric to uninformed eyes. And this, Peter continued, indicating one particular document, is the most interesting. It seems the late husband was involved in a dispute with the church over the ownership of certain historical relics, documents that, according to rumors, he had acquired in a questionable manner. Catherine's eyes shone as she perceived the potential of that material. Continue. The late Mr. Sullivan claimed the documents had been donated to his grandfather by an elderly priest, but the Oak Ridge Diocese always maintained they were taken from the ecclesiastical archive. After his passing, the dispute cooled down, but the documents were never found. And you think she has them? Peter shrugged. I don't know, but the doubt is enough to raise suspicions, isn't it? Especially if someone suggests she might be using these documents for unconventional practices. Catherine smiled, satisfied. It was perfect, much better than she had expected. She didn't need to prove anything concretely. In a traditional community like Oak Ridge, just the suggestion of impropriety, especially involving the church, would be enough to destroy Eleanor's reputation. Excellent work, she praised, discreetly sliding a thick envelope containing money. But I need one more thing. I'm listening. I want these documents to be found in her room at the Bennett estate, preferably along with other suggestive items, and I want respectable witnesses for this finding. Peter hesitated for the first time. That's very risky. It would be breaking and entering, falsification of evidence. I'm paying for discretion, not legal advice. Catherine cut him off coldly. Get a maid, someone who desperately needs money. I'll take care of the rest. On the way back home, Catherine mentally elaborated the next steps of her plan. The partnership announced by Edward between Eleanor and the Bennett Foundation provided the perfect pretext: a scandal involving stolen historical documents and questionable practices would be devastating not just for Eleanor personally, but for her entire academic project. What she didn't know was that at that exact moment, Martha, the housekeeper of the Bennett estate, was discreetly observing her meeting with Peter. The old housekeeper, who had served the family for more than 30 years, had eyes and ears throughout the town, and the sight of the federal judge's daughter in suspicious conversation with a man known for his unscrupulous services had caught her attention. Martha hadn't heard the content of the conversation, but her instinct told her that something dangerous was being plotted, something that could threaten not just the guest she had begun to admire, but the young master himself, for whom she nurtured maternal affection. The next 3 days of the winter festival passed at an intense pace. Eleanor divided her time between lectures, round tables, and supervision of the exhibition she had set up with her most valuable pieces. Thomas, in turn, had immersed himself in the responsibilities of future president of the foundation, meeting with sponsors and authorities. Still, they found moments for quick conversations, meaningful glances, and that growing sense that something important was blossoming between them, despite all the adverse circumstances. To external observers, including Edward Bennett, everything was running perfectly within the expected script, a promising professional collaboration between two people who represented complementary institutions. Only Catherine, with jealousy sharpening her perception, and Ryan, with the sensitivity of a close friend, perceived the deeper currents beneath the surface of the formal interactions. On the morning of the 4th day, as Eleanor prepared to return to her farm after the festival's closing the previous night, Martha discreetly knocked on her door. "Forgive me, Professor, but I'd like a private word with you." The urgent tone, different from the housekeeper's usual cordiality, alerted Eleanor. "Of course, Martha. Please come in." The housekeeper carefully closed the door before speaking in a low voice. "I believe you're in danger. I saw Miss Harrington meeting with a man of dubious reputation. He provides delicate services for influential families who prefer not to dirty their own hands." Eleanor slowly sat on the edge of the bed, absorbing the information. "Are you sure about this?" "Unfortunately, yes, I know this man. In the past, he was hired by local families to solve problems discreetly, from investigating marriage candidates to eliminating potential scandals." "And you think Catherine hired him to?" Eleanor left the sentence incomplete, realizing the implications. "I didn't hear the conversation, but I saw money changing hands, and her expression afterward didn't please me." Martha hesitated. "Miss Harrington has always been determined to get what she wants, and she has wanted Mr. Thomas since they were teenagers." Eleanor took a deep breath, processing the information. "Thank you for the warning, Martha. I'll be careful." "There's more," the housekeeper continued. "I heard rumors among the staff. Someone might try to plant something compromising in your belongings before your departure. If I were you, I would carefully check your things and not leave anything behind." After the housekeeper withdrew, Eleanor meticulously checked each of her possessions. She found nothing suspicious, but followed the advice and made sure she would take everything with her. She was finishing closing her suitcase when a knock on the door announced Thomas's arrival. "Ready to leave?" he asked, entering the room, with an expression that didn't hide his disappointment at the imminent farewell. "Almost," she replied, hesitating for a moment before deciding to share Martha's warning. As she related the housekeeper's warning, she observed Thomas's face harden in a mixture of anger and concern. "This is absurd," he finally said. "Even for Catherine, the idea of sabotaging your reputation is perfectly plausible," Eleanor completed calmly. "You know her better than I do, Thomas. Tell me honestly, would she be capable of this?" His silence was answer enough. "I'll talk to my uncle," Thomas decided. "If Catherine is involved with this type of person, he needs to know." "And do you think he'll care?" Eleanor gently questioned. "Or will he just see it as an inconvenient problem to be discreetly managed?" The question hit at the core of the issue, the same doubt that Thomas had carried for years about the moral nature of his family and the world they lived in. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't simply ignore it." "Neither can I," Eleanor agreed, finally closing her suitcase. "But perhaps this is the moment for deeper decisions than just managing crises." Before Thomas could respond, they were interrupted by Ryan, who hurriedly entered the room. "Forgive the intrusion, but we need to act quickly," he announced, closing the door. "Catherine just arrived with her father and Father Andrew. They're in the office with Edward, and the conversation seems serious." "Well, what's happening?" Thomas asked, alarmed. "Accusations," Ryan responded somberly, "about historical documents missing from the ecclesiastical archive. Apparently, there are suspicions they would be in Eleanor's possession." Eleanor paled. "The documents that Paul was researching before he passed away. The dispute was never completely resolved, but that was years ago." "Well, it seems to have resurfaced now," Ryan observed significantly, "and in a very convenient way." "Why would they come here instead of going directly to my farm?" Eleanor questioned, perceiving the weak point in the strategy. "Because," Thomas suddenly understood, "they expect to find something here. Something that would have been planted," as Martha warned. The three looked at each other, recognizing the gravity of the situation and the need to act quickly. "Ryan, go to the office and try to delay any initiative of theirs," Thomas instructed. "Say that Eleanor is preparing to leave and that I'm helping her. We need time." As Ryan left to fulfill his mission, Thomas turned to Eleanor. "We need to thoroughly review this room. If someone really planted something here, we have to find it before they do." For 20 tense minutes, they examined every corner of the room, drawers, closets, under the bed, behind the pictures. When they were beginning to believe that perhaps the plan hadn't been put into practice, Eleanor noticed something strange in the lining of her document portfolio, a small, almost imperceptible opening where something had been inserted. "Thomas," she called, extending the portfolio to him. "Look at this." Carefully, he removed what was hidden, several pages of an ancient manuscript, with the seal of the Oak Ridge Diocese clearly visible. "My God," Eleanor murmured, shocked. "Someone really planted ecclesiastical documents in my portfolio." "And this," Thomas added, finding a small fabric package hidden along with the papers, "seems to be..." Upon opening the fabric, a small set of objects was revealed that, to uninformed eyes, could easily be interpreted as paraphernalia for mystical rituals: a small statuette, dried herbs, and a parchment with drawn symbols. "Common items in syncretic altars," Eleanor explained, immediately recognizing them. "Perfectly legitimate as objects of anthropological study, but that would be viewed with great suspicion if discovered hidden among stolen documents." The trap was perfect in its simplicity and cruelty, to associate Eleanor not only with the alleged theft of religious documents, but also with practices that the conservative local society would consider, at the very least, questionable. "We need to think fast," Thomas said, putting the compromising items in his own pocket. "They could appear at any moment for a search." "Is there a way out through the back?" Eleanor asked, already gathering her belongings. "Yes, through the kitchen, but we can't simply flee. That would only appear as a confession of guilt." At this moment, Ryan returned, even more agitated than before. "They're coming here. I managed to get only a few minutes' delay, suggesting they wait for Edward to finish. An important call." "How much time do we have?" Thomas asked. 5 minutes at most." Thomas looked at Eleanor, a decision rapidly forming in his mind. "Ryan, take her to the library via the service stairs. There's a private set of documents in the safe that I need to show you both." As they discreetly descended the back stairs, avoiding the main hall where voices could already be heard, Eleanor questioned, "What documents are these that would be so important now?" "If I'm right," Thomas replied quietly, "the proof that this isn't the first time my family and the Harringtons have fabricated a convenient situation. The library of the Bennett estate was a sanctuary of dark wood and ancient books. In a discreet corner, hidden by a rotating bookshelf that few knew how to operate, there was a safe embedded in the wall, the family's private archive where secrets of generations were kept." Thomas typed the combination with quick, precise fingers, revealing an organized collection of folders and documents. He quickly located what he was looking for, a thick folder simply marked "Special Acquisitions." "My father kept detailed records of each significant family transaction," he explained, rapidly leafing through the documents, including those they preferred to keep off the official books. He finally found what he was looking for: a set of letters and receipts dating back 15 years, when Catherine's father, then an ambitious young judge, had become involved in a potential scandal. Anthony Harrington almost lost everything when he was accused of favoring certain interests in his judgments, Thomas explained, showing the documents to Eleanor and Ryan. "My father, seeing an opportunity to secure a powerful ally, intervened. He used contacts, money, and influence to suppress the evidence and save his career." "And in return?" Eleanor asked, though she already suspected the answer. "An unwritten agreement that at the appropriate moment, the families would unite through the marriage of their children," Thomas confirmed bitterly. "Me and Catherine. My God," Ryan murmured, finally understanding the extent of the pressures his friend faced. "And you always knew this?" "I discovered it a few years ago, when I began to question the family's insistence on this union. My father had passed away, but he left these records. I believe in his way he was giving me a choice, to continue the tradition or break with it, but knowing all the facts." "And now?" Eleanor asked softly. Thomas looked at the documents in his hands, then at Eleanor, and finally at the library, door where approaching voices could already be heard. "Now we do what we should have done a long time ago," he replied with new determination. "We confront the truth. When Edward Bennett, Anthony Harrington, Father Andrew, and Catherine entered the library, they found a very different scenario than they expected. Not a professor being caught by surprise with compromising evidence, but 3 people calmly waiting for them, with a collection of documents spread across the large mahogany table. "Ah, you've arrived," Thomas commented casually. "We were just reviewing some very interesting historical documents. I believe you especially will want to see them, Dr. Harrington." The federal judge, immediately recognizing what was on the table, visibly paled. "Thomas, what does this mean?" Edward questioned, irritated by the apparent subversion of the plans. "We're here to address a serious matter involving Professor Sullivan." "Yes, I know," Thomas calmly replied. "An accusation about documents supposedly stolen from the ecclesiastical archive, and curiously, we found this hidden in the professor's portfolio." He removed the planted items from his pocket, placing them on the table. A rather elaborate setup, don't you think? Especially considering that these documents were perfectly safe in the archive until very recently. Someone would have to have privileged access to obtain them. Everyone's eyes involuntarily turned to Catherine, whose expression of shock revealed more than any confession. "I don't know what you're talking about," she tried to defend herself, but her voice trembled slightly. "I believe you do," Ryan intervened, gently pushing forward the pages of the Harrington family's letters and receipts. "Just as your father knows exactly what's at stake here." Father Andrew, confused by the unexpected turn of events, looked from one face to another. "Can someone explain to me what's happening? Where are the missing documents from the archive?" "Right here, Father," Eleanor responded softly, indicating the papers that had been planted in her portfolio. "They were placed among my things as part of a plan to discredit me." "That's absurd," Catherine protested. "You're obviously trying to divert attention from your own guilt." "Interesting theory," Thomas commented, "except that we have a witness. Martha saw you meeting with a man known for special services, the same man, I presume, who provided these items for you." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward Bennett looked at the scene with a mixture of anger and calculation, clearly evaluating how to minimize the damage to both families. "I believe there has been a regrettable misunderstanding," he finally said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Perhaps it's best we discuss this privately between our families." "No, Uncle," Thomas firmly replied. "Enough of private discussions and discreet agreements. This cycle ends here." He stood up, addressing specifically Father Andrew. "Father, the documents that were reported as stolen are all here intact. I believe there was a mistake in the accusations against Professor Sullivan." The priest, perceiving the complexity of the situation and the evident embarrassment of the families involved, opted for discretion. "If the documents are safe, then my main concern is resolved. As for the rest, it seems to be a matter for the families to resolve." Anthony Harrington, recovering part of his composure, placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Catherine, I think we should withdraw. Clearly there has been a misunderstanding." But before they could leave, Eleanor stood up. "There's one issue I'd like to clarify. These documents that were used in this attempt to incriminate me, are they part of the dispute my late husband had with the diocese?" The priest hesitated. "Yes, Professor. Paul Sullivan claimed they had been legitimately donated, but the diocese always maintained they were borrowed without proper authorization." "I understand," Eleanor nodded. "And if I could help locate the original documents, it would be a gesture of goodwill that could definitively end this matter." Her offer surprised everyone. Father Andrew looked at her with renewed interest. That's very much appreciated by the diocese, Professor." "Then it's decided," Eleanor smiled. "Upon returning to my farm, I'll conduct a thorough search in Paul's archives. If the original documents are there, they will be returned where they belong." The diplomatic gesture offered an honorable exit for everyone. The priest would recover the lost documents, and the fabricated accusation against Eleanor would be discreetly forgotten in the name of an amicable resolution. Catherine, realizing that her plot had completely collapsed, couldn't contain her frustration. "This is ridiculous. You're really going to let her leave like this, as if nothing happened?" "Catherine," her father warned in a low voice, "that's enough." "No, it's not enough," she exclaimed, completely losing her composure. "Don't you see? What's happening? She's bewitched him, all of you. With her false modesty and her exotic knowledge, she's exactly the type of woman who—" "What type of woman, Catherine?" Thomas interrupted, his voice dangerously calm. "An independent woman? Intelligent? Who built her own reputation instead of depending on family connections? Who doesn't manipulate and doesn't blackmail to get what she wants?" The unintentional cruelty of the words instantly silenced Catherine. Tears of humiliation shone in her eyes before she abruptly turned and left the library. "My daughter is disturbed," Anthony Harrington tried to explain, clearly uncomfortable. "I apologize for her behavior, Professor." Eleanor accepted the apology with a gracious nod. "There's no need. I believe we all act in extreme ways when we feel threatened." Edward Bennet, realizing that the situation had completely escaped his control, attempted one last maneuver. "Well, now that this misunderstanding has been cleared up, perhaps we can resume our discussions about the partnership between the Foundation and the Research Center." "Actually, Uncle," Thomas replied, "I think we need to reconsider many things before moving forward with any new projects, including my position in the presidency of the Foundation." The declaration fell like a bomb in the room. Edward stared at his nephew in astonishment. "You can't be serious. This is your inheritance, your legacy." "A legacy built on what values exactly?" Thomas gently questioned. "Manipulation? Backroom deals? Alliances based on blackmail and control?" A heavy silence followed his words. Eleanor, perceiving the profound rupture that was occurring, approached Thomas in a silent gesture of support. "Perhaps," Father Andrew unexpectedly intervened, "this is a moment for reflection and renewal, not just for the Bennet family, but for our entire community. Sometimes we need new voices to remind us of the true values that should guide us." His words, surprisingly progressive for a representative of the traditional local church, offered a bridge to the future, an acknowledgement that the old structures were being questioned, but that there could be a path forward that preserved the best of the past while embracing new possibilities. By evening, Eleanor finally departed from Oakridge, but not alone. Thomas accompanied her on the journey back to Willow Creek Farm, both silent as the car wound through the roads that cut across the Virginian mountains. The confrontation in the library had been just the beginning of a greater transformation that was now unfolding. "Are you sure about this?" Eleanor finally asked as they watched the setting sun tinge the hills with gold. "Leaving the presidency of the Foundation, challenging your uncle. These are decisions that will change your life." "My life has already changed," Thomas simply replied. "The moment I entered your farm on that first visit, something awakened in me. The awareness that I had spent years accepting a script written by others, an existence I never really chose. And now? Now I choose my own path," he smiled. "I'm not abandoning my family or my responsibility to Oakridge. I'm just redefining how I'll fulfill that role, with integrity, with real purpose." Eleanor observed him for a long moment. "You know this won't be easy. Your uncle, the Harringtons, local society, they'll all expect you to eventually come to your senses." "Let them wait," Thomas replied, with a tranquility that surprised them both. "I have a partner who taught me that living authentically, no matter how difficult it may be, is the only way to build something truly worthwhile." When they arrived at Willow Creek Farm, the sky was already covered with stars. The same sky that generations of Virginians had observed, seeking guidance, hope, possibilities. Standing on the porch of the main house, contemplating the vastness, above, Eleanor and Thomas didn't need words to express what they both felt. The certainty that they had found in each other, not just love, but a shared vision of a future based on truth and authenticity. In Oakridge, meanwhile, Edward Bennet faced the reality of a world in transformation, where old alliances and manipulations were losing strength in the face of new ways of thinking and living. Catherine Harrington, in her room, began the painful process of questioning everything she had always believed was her natural right. And somewhere between these two realities, the new one flourishing on the farm and the old one transforming in the historic town, was the true heart of Virginia. The ability to preserve what is valuable from the past while courageously opening up to the possibilities of the future. The story of Eleanor and Thomas, like so many others born in the Virginian mountains, would be told for generations, not as a tale of princes and spells, but as a reminder that true power lies not in controlling others, but in having the courage to live according to the truth of one's own heart. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Eleanor and Thomas has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey through Virginia and other American landscapes filled with romance and intrigue, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it here on the left side of the video. If you like this narrative where true love triumphs over prejudices and outdated traditions, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human relationships in typically American settings. Share your impressions in the comments. Do you believe Catherine might find her own path to redemption, or will Edward finally embrace the changes that Thomas proposes for the Bennet family? We're eager to read your opinions and suggestions for future stories. Until the next emotional adventure,